Welcome back, everyone. Now it's time for our first panel discussion, Prosperity Without Democracy, Rethinking Modernization Theory in the 21st Century. This session will explore the evolving relationship between democracy and capitalism. For decades, modernization theory has suggested that economic growth fosters democracy. But today, that assumption no longer seems to hold. Some countries have achieved remarkable growth under non-democratic systems, while others have faced democratic backsliding. Even within established democracies, we are witnessing the rise of far-right movements. And across much of the global south, new hybrid regimes are emerging, blending elections with authoritarian control. That's further blurring the link between prosperity and democracy. This panel will revisit modernization theory and share fresh perspectives on how capitalism and political systems shape one another today. The moderator is Mukoyama Naosuke, Associate Professor at the Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo. He specializes in international relations and comparative politics. His research focuses on how sovereign states emerge and develop. He's the author of Fueling Sovereignty, Colonial Oil and the Creation of Unlikely States, which delves into the role oil resources play in the nation building of small states. So Mukoyama Sensei, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Imamoto-san. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first panel discussion. My name is Naosuke Mukoyama, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's discussion. As mentioned in the introduction, our session revisits one of the most influential ideas in political science, which is the notion that economic development naturally leads to democracy. For decades, this seemed to describe the trajectories of Western Europe and North America, as well as some East Asian countries like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. But recent developments around the world have made this assumption far less secure. And if you look at the past 10 or 20 years, there's no doubt that the world economy has witnessed significant development. Economic growth has been driven especially by the rapid rise of emerging economies like China and India. And in terms of economic sectors, technological sectors have boomed with advances in digital services, AI, and high-tech manufacturing, which reshaped productivity and created new globally integrated industries. However, we can't say the same about politics. Over the past 2 decades, the world has experienced a clear decline in liberal democracy. According to the Varieties of Democracy, which is a leading academic project that measures democratic institutions worldwide, the average level of democracy in the world peaked in early 2010s and has since then fallen back to the levels last seen in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The world has now fewer democracies than autocracies for the first time in over 20 years. And in 2024, 72% of people in the world live in non-democratic countries, which is the highest proportion since 1978. So we can't really simply say that tomorrow will be better than today or next year will be better than this year. So we're now living in the world of democratic backsliding and autocratization. We're seeing authoritarian states in the global south delivering sustained economic growth, while countries that were known to be democratic previously facing a clear erosion of democracy. And far-right parties have surged across Europe, and the United States is facing deep polarization and disputes over electoral legitimacy. And all of this forces us to reconsider the relationship between prosperity and democracy. And to help us make sense of these new issues, we're fortunate to have 4 distinguished scholars with us today. The first speaker is Professor Erika Franz from Michigan State University, who is a leading specialist on authoritarian politics, whose comparative and theoretical work sheds light on the global evolution of non-democratic regimes. And the second speaker is Professor Takeshi Kawanaka from Asia University, who is an expert on political regimes in Southeast Asia, especially the Philippines, with deep insight into how democracy and authoritarianism coexist and compete in the region. The third speaker is Professor Seung-Hyu Kim from Korea University, who is a prominent scholar of Korean democratization and public administration, and he will offer an important perspective on democratic development and its vulnerabilities in South Korea. And lastly, Professor Tomoko Ako from the University of Tokyo, who is a leading authority on politics and society in the Chinese-speaking world, with extensive networks across mainland China, Hong Kong, and beyond. And she's going to provide a unique view into contemporary democratic movements. So contrary to the previous session, we're going to talk a lot about China in this discussion. Here's how this session will proceed. Each speaker will have about 8 to 10 minutes to present, and then offering perspectives from their respective areas of expertise. And then we'll move into the discussion in which I'll ask individual and overall questions to the speakers and invite the speakers to engage with each other and reflect on broader comparative themes. So our goal is to create a conversation that's accessible, comparative, and deeply grounded in empirical realities. So let's begin with our first speaker, Professor Erika Franz. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real thrill to be part of this forum and also to be on this wonderful panel. So I'm going to start things off today and give a broad overview of the state of global democracy, highlight some trends and implications that we're seeing in the field, and then I'll leave it to my panelists here to get into some individual cases of how this all is working. And do we have the, great, thank you. Okay, so I wanted to start off by giving some insight into the global political landscape. And we got into this a little bit earlier with the VDEM data about how democracy is doing globally. But this is a similar portrait that we can see from Freedom House, which is this watchdog organization that monitors levels of global freedom. And this is from 2025. The green countries are free democracies. The yellow countries are partly free or kind of a mix of democracy and autocracy. And then the purple countries are dictatorships or autocracies. On the one hand, you can see that a lot of the world is in green and yellow, which means that we have quite a bit of freedom. That's good. But on the other hand, there's a lot of purple on this map, which is somewhat troubling. And as was mentioned earlier, Freedom House has documented nearly 20 years of consecutive declines in global freedom. I'm sure this is not the first time that you've heard that democracy is under stress, but the reality is that democracy is under a lot of stress, which is something that I'm going to get into today and highlight some of the reasons why we're seeing this. So before I wanted to motivate you and give you some reason why you should care that democracy is experiencing challenges. If we consider a democracy using a really basic definition, a political system where there are free and fair elections, okay? So where there are free and fair elections, using a very basic definition of democracy, we see a lot of really positive outcomes on a variety of fronts. And I should note, most dictatorships also hold elections, which I'll circle back to later. But those elections are not competitive or meaningful, and they don't meaningfully translate into the political leadership. So, using a very basic definition of democracies as systems where we have free and fair elections, research has shown that we see greater economic stability. Economic miracles happen out of dictatorships, but so too do economic disasters. With democracies, it's more of a steady progress where you have more reliable economic growth rates. Democracies also have more public goods investments. So you're more likely to see investments in things like roads or provisions of water. You're even more likely to see agreements on things like climate change. Democracies, perhaps not surprisingly, also have better human rights outcomes. So we know that levels of repression are lower in democracies. You're more likely to see media freedom, as another example. And then, as a more basic level, you even have higher life expectancy in democratic settings. So if you're born in a democracy, you can expect to live for longer than if you're born in a dictatorship. I'm not even going to get into all of the foreign policy positives that come out of democratic governance, but there are many. So there's good reason to support global democracy as a political system that would be more likely to give us greater prosperity, peace, stability, and so forth. In terms of where we see democracy, in line with this session's theme on modernization theory, here I have a plot that shows you levels of wealth along that x-axis, it's logged GDP per capita, and then level of democracy on the y-axis. And you can see that there is a very tight positive correlation with how rich a country is and whether it is likely to be democratic. That is indeed a core expectation of modernization theory. I'm not going to get into the direction of causality, which is something that scholars debate quite a bit. But if we just look at simple numbers, we see that democracy goes hand in hand with wealth. And again, this would be one of the core expectations of modernization theory, that as countries grow richer, they're going to be more likely to be democratic. There are some outliers there in the bottom right of that graph, and those are predominantly natural resource-rich dictatorships, along with Singapore. But otherwise, this relationship is pretty tight. And it goes hand in hand with something that we know in the literature about the two key factors that protect democracies from backsliding to dictatorship. So we know, using our data and our resources, that democracies that are longer lasting, so that have a greater number of consecutive years of governance, democratic governance, are far less likely to collapse to dictatorship. And the same is true with richer democracies. This means that if you're a democracy that has been in power for a long time and that you're wealthy, it simply is unlikely that you're going to transition to dictatorship or otherwise erode. Okay, so this is our received wisdom about the things that protect democracy from backsliding. But we have noticed that there have been some surprising trends of late. And here I put together a list, just a snapshot of a handful of countries where democracy is threatened. This includes India, Israel, Madagascar, Mexico, the United States, where I'm based. Also a handful of democracies that have collapsed to authoritarianism. And here we have Benin, El Salvador, Hungary, Serbia, Turkey. And what's striking about this list of countries is that they represent a variety of different places, different regions in the world, different experiences with democracy, different levels of wealth. This is simply not consistent with what we would have expected given our received wisdom. And it suggests that something different is happening today. So here I put together some very basic summary statistics about levels of wealth when democracies have collapsed. And you can see that from the 1990s to the 2000s to the 2010s, the typical democracy that transitioned to dictatorship got richer and richer. This all begs the question of whether wealth still protects democracy from backsliding. And it appears that our received wisdoms, rather, about the traditional protectors of democracy really needs to shift. One thing you might wonder, why is this happening? Well, one major development is that democracies, the key threat to democracy today has changed in really significant ways. Historically, the military was the main threat to a democracy. And military coups were the primary way that most democracies fell apart. We know from the literature, military coups are a lot more likely in poorer places, and in places that have experienced prior coups. Well, today, fast forward, and the major threat to democracy comes from elected leaders. The primary way that today's democracies fall apart is when leaders elected in democratic elections slowly chip away at democratic institutions until they are no more. And in this regard, being wealthy and having an established democracy is no longer protecting countries from this development. In fact, we're seeing that all over the globe, democracies are at risk from these incumbent takeovers. Our research can point to a very critical reason why, and that is the rise of personalist politics. With personalist politics, we have leaders coming to power in free and fair elections, backed by political parties that are pretty much synonymous with the leader themselves. And here I have an image from El Salvador with Nayib Bukele. And he created his own political party, Nueva Ideas. His supporters are wearing a shirt with his image on it. So with these personalist parties, the party is not about a clear programmatic platform, but rather about the leader and advancing the leader's career. This is troubling for democracy because elites in these parties are typically friends and family members of the leader, rather than people who have much political experience. And as a result, when these leaders push forward with a power grab, there is no one from within their party to do much. Once these parties get legislative majorities, the chance of democratic collapse and backsliding goes up substantially, and that's for controlling for a whole range of factors, such as the degree to which people support democracy, levels of wealth, and so forth. So the rise of personalist politics today is a key and important threat to today's democracy that we have to be aware of, as is the new authoritarian model we're seeing, where today most autocracies hold multi-party elections. They try to mimic democracies on a variety of fronts. And the research has shown pretty robust evidence that this new model where autocracies try to adopt pseudo-democratic institutions is associated with a more robust form of authoritarianism. The basic message is, in terms of this theme of rethinking capitalism, we certainly need to rethink modernization theory and the degree to which wealth can be a protector for today's democracies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Franz. So we heard about the global trends from Professor Franz, and now we'll move on to presentations that are more region-specific or country-specific. Our second speaker is Professor Takeshi Kawanaka. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Mukoyama. I'm very glad to be here with the distinguished panelists. My name is Takeshi Kawanaka. I'm going to talk about Southeast Asia. Okay, my presentation title is Unfulfilled Aspiration for Change, the Popular Support for Democratic Backsliding in Southeast Asia. So in Southeast Asia, we also find some countries which are experiencing democratic backsliding. So how can we explain those backsliding, and then what general implication can we get from that? That is my main thesis here. Okay. So democratic backsliding is a major concern in political science because, as Professor Franz said, that the advanced economies are supposed to be stable, but those countries are now suffering from a kind of backsliding. So why it happens? So but much of the theoretical development has been based on cases from the U.S., Europe, and Latin America. Here is my question. Is democratic backsliding caused by single causal mechanism? My answer is no. Different mechanisms in different contexts. So we need to take a look at a really complex, the context and also the complexity of the causal mechanism. So I think Southeast Asia offers insights into how backsliding works in developing countries. So it's not only Southeast Asia, but also developing countries which, suffering from democratic backsliding. I think we can get some implications from the cases of Southeast Asian countries. Okay. So I'd like to start from the kind of a simple model which explains the democratic backsliding in advanced economies. Well, democratic backsliding is always, discussed with the polarization. In advanced economies, backsliding is driven or at least accompanied by polarization. So society is divided, and the friends love each other, but they hate the enemies. And why it happens? First, economic grievances, especially economic inequality. So the income gap is getting wider and wider, and they cannot get some kind of compromises between the different classes. Second, cultural backlash. That is I think it is, ironically, it is the result of modernization. Modernization, it also includes the education, literacy. So after the modernization, the people acquire new values like DEI or environmental free activities or LGBTQ, that kind of things. But there are some groups in the society. they try to respect more family values, the traditional family values or communal values or the religious values. So there is a backlash from those conservative sector. So those two factors cause the polarization. Then eventually democratic backsliding take places in advanced economies. Okay, what about Southeast Asia? Can we see the same pattern, polarization, democratic backsliding? In Southeast Asia, democratic backsliding is usually caused by strong leadership, and it is backed by the aspiration for change. Why? Because they still suffer from underdevelopment, poverty, inadequate infrastructure, high crime rates, so people are still frustrated, and they like to have a kind of development that is a kind of change for them. And it goes with the weak institutions. Political parties cannot accommodate people's demands. The government institutions, they cannot provide proper public goods. So instead of trusting institutions, they trust personality. And that causes strong leadership. So particularly in the Philippines and Indonesia, these two countries are major democratized countries in the region, and then we can see these patterns of democratic backsliding. This figure shows the time series change of the score of the developed democracy index. That is one of the indexes of the variety of democracy. It measures the level of the democracy in the country. And two bold lines show the trends of Indonesia and the Philippines. As you see, obviously, two countries are suffering from backsliding. And then other countries like Singapore, Malaysia, surprisingly, they are supposed to be authoritarian countries. Before we discussed that, the countries are authoritarian. But their scores are slightly better at this moment than Indonesia and the Philippines. Why it happens? Institutions and the leadership, these are the keys. Okay, weak institutions. The Philippines, instead of building strong institutions, they still have strong social forces like landowners, the family business owners, and local warlords. And the party system is not well developed. The party system is so weak. New parties comes up and then they disappear. Party switching is quite frequent. Indonesia, after they had a democratization in 1998, they tried to strengthen the institutions. They amended the constitutions 4 times and tried to prevent the Suharto-type authoritarian leader to come up again. But that effort has been undermined. Political institutions, particularly government institutions and party systems, fail to accommodate societal demands. And here comes a strong leadership. Chief executive free from constraints, that's what the people wanted. So all the traditional institutions are captured by elites, so-called elites, and they monopolize the benefits, something like that. So they like to have a strong leader who are free from the obstruction caused by those traditional elites. And these two countries, the Philippines and Indonesia, they have a presidential system, meaning people can cast the votes directly who's gonna be the leader of the country. So it causes it results in a kind of personalization of politics. So people vote not based on the party, not based on the policy platform, but based on the personality. So I'll pick up one case, President Rodrigo Duterte. I think you have heard the name. He's now in Hague waiting for the trial. And he was the president of the Philippines between 2016 and 2022. He caused a kind of declining democracy, but he was so supported. Approval rating was so high. He's known for that war on drugs. But he ordered the police to kill drug pushers on the street without any due process. And the estimates of up to 30,000 deaths, that is calculated by NGO, human rights group. And so that is now the basis of the trial in Hague, ICC. And he also oppressed the opposition. He imprisoned the opposition senator based on the fake basis, and the media has been oppressed. Famous, well-known Nobel laureate Maria Ressa was arrested, and she was charged. And also the biggest TV network, they are not allowed to renew their license. And also he tried to control the judiciary. He ousted the Chief Justice who was critical about Duterte's policies. Okay, here I prepared a figure which showed the change of net satisfaction rating of the president in the Philippines and also Liberal Democracy Index in the Philippines. Okay, this period is the Duterte administration. You can see that the highest net satisfaction rating, lowest Liberal Democracy Index. And there is another survey which asked the level of satisfaction with the democracy in the country, and then the people in the Philippines show the highest, the satisfaction with the democracy, meaning the people who supported the Duterte, they don't think the Duterte as authoritarian rule. They saw that the Duterte was the leader which can materialize the demands of the people. So in a sense, they think that he was democratic, okay. So gap is quite high. So in some democratic backsliding, Southeast Asia backsliding is driven by frustration with the current institutions and aspiration for change. And it's different from the democratic backsliding advanced economies because it's across society rather than the polarization. Of course, the society has several social privileges, and before they had a kind of polarization problem. But now the democratic backsliding in these countries are not caused by the polarization, more on frustration. Okay, and so here comes the performance legitimacy. Performance legitimacy matters more than democratic procedure and institution, even if the performance is more symbolic than real. They just believe that it's better, but the fact we are not sure about that. And weak institutions is the key. Weak institutions enables personalization of politics and authoritarian leadership. So still a bit classical, explanation, but still, economic development and strong institutional capacity remain crucial prerequisites for developing countries to consolidate their democracy. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kawanaka. So our third speaker is Professor Seung-Hyu Kim, who is going to focus on the case of South Korea. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much. And I feel very honored to speak in front of this distinguished audience. As the title actually says, it's prosperity without and with democracy in that sequence. As the title adumbrates, the scorecard for Korea in terms of this topic is quite mixed. On the one hand, development happened without democracy in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. On the other hand, democracy ensued development, and the two, development and democracy, have coexisted with each other since 1987. This dual or two-sided experience, development without and with democracy, is precisely at the heart of the current debate on Korean democracy. If development and democracy, the two good things, always go together, we don't need to worry about anything. I think we all gladly convert to the strong supporters of democracy. But because we had this historical experience of development without democracy, a sizable number of Koreans tolerate and even endorse authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is not something to absolutely abominate, denigrate, or oppose in Korea. Hence, the question of development and democracy in Korea becomes rather complicated. On facade, Korea is a textbook case. verifying what Guillermo O'Donnell long time ago termed the optimistic equation, namely a positive correlation between development and democracy. In Korea, we had a rapid economic growth between 1960s and 1980s under authoritarian rules of Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan, and attained development dubbed a miracle on the Han River. On the other hand, we also accomplished democratization. A democratic transition obtained in 1987 in the wake of middle-class expansion, education, and urbanization, all of which were in large part result of economic development and democratization. The happy ending of development followed by democratization apparently supports Lips's thesis on modernization. Development enabled, if not caused, democracy. But you cannot judge a book by its cover only. A close look at the Korean case betrays much more complex reality. As I mentioned already, the impressive and almost miraculous economic development of the past decades coexisted with dictatorship, political authoritarianism, or authoritarian developmentalism, whatever name you prefer to use. Modernization in Korea was evidently state-led under repressive regimes. Economic growth persisted without political liberalization for decades. Development and political authoritarianism were not only compatible with each other, it is beyond simple compatibility. Authoritarianism is presumed to causally promoted the development. In other words, authoritarianism was believed to be instrumental to the achievement of compressed, almost explosive development in South Korea. The Korean story would have ended right there with simple conclusion that the Korean version of dictatorship was useful for development if we didn't have the second chapter entitled democratization. But Koreans also fortunately achieved democracy, and that's why we have one more question. Did development caused by authoritarianism eventually precipitated its demise also, thereby bringing about democracy? Or was democratization due to something totally separate? Democratization in Korea has many different explanations, most representatively mass politics, mass protest, elite splits, and international context. But the main factor was undoubtedly massive protest mobilization against authoritarianism and for democracy. Civil society, consisting of student groups, religious organizations, and labor unions, and its mobilization was central to democratization. The modernization theory obviously downplays them. So as far as the Korean case is concerned, the putative causal relationship between development and democracy is weak, if not outright spurious. In this respect, Korea's transition was contingent, not deterministic or mechanical. Contingent, voluntaristic, and human agentic factors played much more crucial roles. Let's now turn to the post-1987 decades. Nascent democracy in Korea went through consolidation, deepening, and maturation. We have had our fair share of tribulations in the process, sometimes caused by the complex and contentious nature of consolidational politics, often magnified by global economic and political changes that adversely affected socioeconomic inequalities and more recently political polarization. Modernization neither prevented nor eliminated populism or democratic dysfunction. Modernization evidently is not a panacea for various ills of Korean democracy. And this challenges the idea that development leads to stable liberal democracy. The middle class played important roles in democratization in Korea. They joined mobilization, albeit at the very last minute in 1987. Middle class was the backbone of Korean democracy, but their contribution to democratization was at best opportunistic and pretty contingent. They were both the beneficiaries of authoritarian development and the late contributors to democratization. That middle class was hit hard by socioeconomic polarization that aggravated through the era of neoliberal globalization and also the recent pandemic. Youth and middle class voters in Korea support illiberal or populist candidates. Perhaps this is a global phenomenon. Korea is not particularly immune to this problem. Development fostered democracy, but did not inoculate democracy by instilling and disseminating liberal ideas. So what are the lessons for the global South and other developing regions of the world? Korea's path to development was state-managed and export-oriented. Some of the elements accounting for development are applicable, but most are irreplicable because they were very idiosyncratic and thus unemulatable domestic and international contexts. Democracy in Korea came from contestation and mobilization more than economic development. So we have to have a hybrid or compromised view or eclectic view. Development mattered, but agency and crisis were more decisive. To sum up, Korea neither fully supports nor refutes modernization theory. Modernization may be necessary, but not sufficient for democracy in Korea. The Korean case calls for a nuanced, multidimensional theory, highlighting the delicate interaction between agency and structure, actors and history, domestic configurations and global context. Economic downturn might undermine and militate against democracy, and economic prosperity might undergird and justify democracy, but never deterministically. Perhaps we need distinctively non-economic, that is to say political measures for protecting and preserving democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. Okay, our final speaker is Professor Tomoko Ako, who is going to focus on China. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm a China studies expert and teaching sociology and China studies here in the University of Tokyo. Okay, next slide. That slide.
Professor Kim,
can I have this? Yeah. Okay. Okay, over the past decade, the world has experienced the strengthening of authoritarianism and the authoritarianization of democratic societies. In China, Deng Xiaoping led the country on the path of economic reform in the late 1970s, vowing to build socialism with Chinese characteristics. More than 30 years have passed since then, and China's modernization efforts have produced something quite different from the working class paradise that Deng envisioned. Corruption is rampant, income inequality has widened sharply, and social tensions have risen. In the early 1990s, changes in the control and ownership of state assets allowed well-connected government officials and businessmen to amass enormous wealth through the systematic plundering of state assets, particularly land, natural resources, and state-owned enterprises. Min Xin-pei collected compelling evidence from over 200 corruption cases involving government officials, law enforcement officials, private entrepreneurs, and members of organized crime, revealing how elite collusion has created a corrupt market for power within the party state, where bribes and official appointments are traded covertly but routinely. The system of crony capitalism normalizes widespread corruption, entrenches privilege, and makes any movement toward democracy difficult and disorderly. For decades, China watchers have argued that economic liberalization and growing prosperity would bring democracy to China. However, the Communist Party's grip on power has only strengthened. Why? The effectiveness of China's surveillance state comes not just from advanced technology like facial recognition, AI, and cell phone tracking. While these are important, even more important is the extensive, labor-intensive espionage infrastructure China has deployed domestically. Following the 1989 Tiananmen massacre, the Chinese Communist Party poured enormous resources into enforcement agencies run by a relatively small number of secret police. These agencies mobilized millions of citizen informants and had the capacity to spy on suspected disloyalty. Over the past week, the Chinese government has been enraged by Prime Minister Takaichi's remarks about Taiwan, leading to a series of cancellations of group tours to Japan and study abroad programs, and the suspension of imports of Japanese seafood and so on. While these sanctions on economic activity will actively cause significant losses to Chinese companies, I believe the Chinese government will not make concessions. This is because China is currently facing serious corruption and bribery problems, as can be seen from the successive downfalls of senior military officials. Furthermore, the economy has not recovered, and the political situation is unstable due to the failure of policy during the COVID-19 pandemic and real estate-related policies, as well as a trade war with the United States and other countries. The Chinese government is trying to vent its people's frustration against external enemies. Moreover, under the strengthened surveillance system that encourages mutual reporting, people feel fearful and feel that only loyalty will protect them. Propaganda is preventing many from developing critical thinking skills. Furthermore, nationalism in the digital age, where discussion space based on algorithmic bias becomes mainstream, has promoted my country first attitude and national culture, making cyber racism more prominent. In this context, hate crimes are actually occurring even in democratic countries. Amid this, productivity in China is plummeting. An increasing number of young people are strongly deciding not to marry or have children. Most of the young Chinese people I know have made this decision. They face so much pressure from the state, their families, and society that they lack confidence in starting a family. They also suffer from various traumas. This illustration was created at a museum in Guangdong province during the COVID-19 pandemic. But the artist was told to remove it after just one day. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many people were taken away by police, subcontractors wearing protective gear during the forced lockdown. When girls told a young person who resisted leaving his home, "If you don't follow orders, the punishment will extend to the next generation." And the young person replied, "It's okay, there will be no generation after me." The phrase "last generation" became a hidden buzzword this year in China. Hong Kong, where civic groups used to be active and free, and where memorial rallies for the Tiananmen massacre were held every year, has now become a city where it can no longer speak about the importance of political freedom and must instead spread Chinese propaganda. Taiwan, too, is no longer able to engage in activities that would provoke China too much as tension between the two grow. Japan, and particularly Tokyo, has become an important hub for Chinese people to gather and engage in cultural activities and citizen exchanges, not through its own intention, but due to changes in the external environment. I do not think that the situation is such that wealthy Japanese intellectuals are trying to support Chinese intellectuals, as was the case when Sun Yat-sen and others prepared for revolution in Tokyo at the end of Qing dynasty. In recent years, many cultural activities and citizen exchanges have been held in Tokyo, and just as the Chinese University of Hong Kong previously did, the University of Tokyo has been hosting many Chinese public intellectuals to engage in serious discussions about the issues facing China, Japan, and the world. You can see these flyers, and people are raising hands and asking a lot of questions actively. This is a social media camp, and then also you can see a lot of people come to Japan in search of freedom. This is a concert organized by Li Ji. His concert has been banned in China for 5 years. And this is a social media campaign conceived and implemented by young people in China. Last year, Chinese people with anti-Japan sentiment attacked Japanese schools in China, resulting in the death of a 7-year-old boy at the Shenzhen Japanese school. He was stabbed multiple times with a knife in front of his mother. Shortly before that, a female bus attendant was stabbed to death while trying to protect a Japanese parent and a child at the Japanese school in Suzhou. On the day the Japanese boy died, I happened to be holding a workshop with young Chinese activists. They had harbored a deep hatred for Japanese people since childhood, but they believed that while learning history is important, education that instills hatred is wrong, so they started this campaign. If you take a picture of your finger with the light of your cell phone, it looks like a lantern mourning the dead. 7 days after the boy's death, they floated this lantern online. This campaign was only able to run in China for 3 days. On the 3rd day, police came to the homes of 3 young people for questioning. An online police blocked account trying to spread the campaign. I invited Japanese students to join us in this activity, but most showed no interest. I think Japanese young people are unable to understand the reality of Chinese young people who are being deprived of their humanity through strict censorship. They are trying to find something they can do even in such circumstances. The basis for communication is completely different. The world inside the walls of a dictatorship state where speech is censored is very different from the world outside. How can we communicate between people who live under fear and surveillance, who have their free thought restricted, and those who live in a world where freedom of thought and expression is guaranteed? At least under a democratic system, I believe that the presence of people who act as intermediaries is important. Economic activity and online space are based on relationships of mutual dependence that transcend national borders. People travel across borders. I believe that people with specialized knowledge and ability to think rationally need to stand between people with different views and create mechanisms that allow them to come to an understanding and compromise, even if only a little, in order to ease tensions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ako. Thank you very much for the 4 powerful presentations, and now it's time to move on to the discussion, but we are a little bit behind schedule, so instead of starting with individual questions to each speaker and moving on to the common question for all speakers, I'll reverse the order, and I'll ask the same question to all 4 speakers, and then if we still have time, we might be able to ask some individual questions. And this common question I have for all 4 speakers is, so we have talked about the global trend or some country-specific trends in other countries outside of Japan, but we haven't really talked about Japan. And I'd like you to invite our panelists to reflect briefly on Japanese democracy today. And based on your research and comparative perspectives, how would you evaluate the current state of Japanese democracy and its key strengths and vulnerabilities, perhaps? Let's start with Professor Franz.
Sure. So I'm going to keep my remarks very short because I know very little about Japanese politics. But I'm going to sell that as a positive because I study dictatorships. And so it is not a good thing if I know a lot about the politics of your country. From a zoomed out perspective, there are very few red flags from my perspective on Japanese democracy being at risk. And one of the big things that I look for is, like I mentioned in my talk, personalist political parties. And you have a new prime minister. She's from a long-standing traditional party. She had to rise her way up the party to get that position. Those are actually healthy things for a democracy, regardless of whether you disagree or agree with that politician's political platform and so forth. The slight concern would be the increasing popularity of the far-right party, but I'll let the other panelists get into that.
Thank you very much. I was very prepared for a harsh feedback.
No.
But,
You're doing great.
Very good response. Okay, Professor Kawanaka.
Okay. Well, I believe in the democracy in Japan. Well, I'm still confident that Japan can keep the democracy. But implications which I got from the Southeast Asian cases, there are some signs like party system institutionalization. The party system is not. Well, still, institutionalized here in Japan, but as you see that it's getting fluid somehow, so it's not a good sign. And then another one is the strong leadership accompanied by personalization of politicians. I mean the personalization of politics. If people focus on the personality of the leaders, and they try to elect the leader based on the assessment of the personality, it might give some problem to the democracy. That's what I'd like to say. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Another positive note about Japanese democracy. Professor Kim?
Yes, if we talk about the relationship between democracy and prosperity, I think there are 4 permutations, right? No democracy, no prosperity. So that's not something we are going to talk about. Democracy and prosperity, that's something that's good. I think that's right now in Korea. I think Japan in the past. That I'm going to go to that a little bit later. And no democracy, prosperity. I think that was in the past of South Korea. And there can be democracy, no prosperity. That's what I'm talking about, current Japan, all right? I mean, let's talk about economic development first. I think everybody knows that Korea learned from Japan a lot in terms of economic development. We learned the developmental model from Japan, and we try to emulate Japan as soon as possible. But the political side of that prosperity was quite different because in Japan there was democracy, right? And despite this one party dominant kind of the system, I think there was no doubt that it was a truly democracy. So there was no problem. But Japan in the recent decades has become, in my mind, I think democracy without too much prosperity. And this is no good. I think democracy, as previous presenters actually emphasized, needs legitimacy. And legitimacy should be backed up by performance. And we need to have democratic performance that can compete rather effectively with authoritarian performance. So I think we should overcome, I think in the case of Japanese democracy, policy stagnation or lack of innovation in some sense, and lack of social dynamism. I think we need to be, I think both South Korea and Japan, we need to strengthen our democracy with our performance. And because we are the two leading democracies in East Asia, we need to be effective democracies. We need to be strong democracies that can tell, I think, a lot of good things to our authoritarian competitors.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. Professor Ako?
Yes. I'm very critical to my own country, because we have a neighbor and very authoritarian country, but I don't think that Japanese politicians and lawmakers, scholars also, are trying to talk with Chinese people. They are, in fact, Chinese economy has been developing, and a lot of people are now have a very clear ideas about democracy. public intellectuals and investigative journalists and young activists. I don't know how many Japanese politicians listen to their voices. We can talk with them. Yeah, we can collaborate with them. And of course, China, they have a very different, narratives, and it's very difficult. Even recent, 2-3 days, I don't think that this, Taiwan issue, without strategic, so-called strategic ambiguity, we cannot solve. There is no 100% correct answer because Taiwan and China have different views. It's very difficult to have, to compromise each other. But, when we think about democracy and, mutual understanding in Asia, we should think about democracy from transnational perspective, right? We are facing transnational repression from authoritarian countries. Then why don't we talk about democracy from transnational perspective? But I don't think Japanese politicians, lawmakers have this idea. I really hope that they can, think more about that, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's a really important point that democracy in one country is not just complete in one country. It's a transnational aspect of democracy. So we don't have much time left, but I just want to ask one question to one speaker. Sorry for the other speakers, but Professor Kim, I would like to ask you one thing, because we're going to have a youth session tomorrow, and you pointed out in your presentation that many young people and middle-class voters in South Korea show support for populist or illiberal leaders. And I think the same could be said to some extent about Japanese youth as well. Polls show that there's increasing support for populist parties among the youth. Why do you think this is happening? Is this sort of a temporary situation, or is it something more structural, long-term shift in the preference of young people?
Right. I didn't mention this, but I think there is one additional layer about these differing perceptions about democratic performance in Korea among young generation people, because there is this gender divide. I think particularly there are these male supporters for populist and authoritarian ideas, and I think female supporters female voters are relatively progressive and liberal. And I think perhaps there are different theories coming out these days about this phenomenon. But I think maybe we can point out the perception of young male voters in terms. They have this perception of their background or their kind of youth history in terms of they somehow had been persecuted by this female dominant world or something. So that this is very related with how they perceive the world. And economic stagnation to some extent, and increasing polarization of society, and the sense of relative depravity. They think they have a lot of the differences with those who have much better assets because of their rich parents and so on. So I think this sense of socioeconomic inequality also galvanized the young male voters' perception of politics.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all our speakers for their thoughtful insights. I hope today's session has offered perspectives that help us think more clearly about the situation surrounding democracy and prosperity today, and encouraged all of us to reflect on the future of democracy in our own contexts. So please join me in giving our panelists a big round of applause. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Motoyama, and all the speakers on the stage for making us think about the relationship between economic growth and democracy through different examples, and giving us insights on what complex situation we need to navigate through in order to pursue a healthier future. So please give the panel another round of applause.